So, what we have assumed and suspected for a long time has finally been confirmed. There's very little that's private about our lives anymore. From traffic cameras, to street cameras on the corner, to satellites roaming overhead. It seems like every one of our cell phone conversations is recorded. Every time we go on the internet, it's being recorded for profiling purposes. And all this is done under the guise of keeping us safe, of determining who's doing good and who's doing bad. And I think that sometimes as Christians, there's a temptation for us to see God in the same way that we see the NSA, the National Security Administration. We sometimes think that God's this big surveillance satellite in the sky, that he's up there constantly scrutinizing every little thing that we do, watching every little thing in the hopes that we're going to mess up so he can take care of it or punish us for it. It's almost like we see God as this God who's up there in the sky with this eternal scorecard, determining good and bad, whether or not we deserve heaven or we deserve hell. And for me, I think this all goes back to our mothers. It's Father's Day, so I have to go easy on Father's Day. But maybe this happened to you when you were a kid. You got into a fight with your brother or your sister, and it was a really bad fight, and then you turned around and you said something really, really mean and horrible to your sibling. And then in your anger, you turned around to storm out of the room and you stubbed your toe on the door frame and you cried out in pain. And as you were crying out in pain, you heard a voice from the distance, the voice of your mother say, "See, God heard you and God got you." Now, whether or not God is up there keeping a record of what we do, especially the sins, really isn't the point. I think there are times in the history of the church where this relationship between sin and forgiveness has been utilized in a way towards motivating our behavior, maybe behavioral manipulation through guilt. And really the fact of the matter is I can't tell you definitively what God keeps a record of and what God doesn't keep a record of, but what I can tell you is this, that God is not up there keeping an eternal scorecard in the hopes that the population of heaven is a very small, exclusive club. When God calls us to see our sin, when God points out the dangers of sin, he's doing so because he wants what is best for us. He knows what is best for us. I think sometimes for us, there is confusion for us concerning the law of God. The law of God are all the commandments, the mandates, the directives, the advice, the encouragement, the disciplines that God gives to us in his holy word. And these things are given to us not so that we walk around our lives in fear, wondering what's going to be seen next every time we mess up. No. God gives us these things, this instruction manual, because he created us. He knows us. He knows what's best for us. He sees where our lives are headed, and as our designer, he wants things to go smoothly. The best example or illustration I have of understanding the law of God and how it works in our lives is the ongoing struggle that parents have with their children and the kitchen stove. From a time that children are very small and begin to motivate and begin to talk, parents are constantly saying to their children, what? Don't touch the stove. Why? Because the parents hate the child and they don't want the child to enjoy all the blessings that a stove will bring? Absolutely not. The parents love the child. They want the child never to go through the pain and agony of burning themselves on a stove that may still be hot. But what happens when the child stops listening to the word of the parent? When all of a sudden, that which is feared happens. Does the parent go, ha, now you're burnt, now you're hurting, and now you're on your own, I'm not going to do anything about it? Absolutely not, I hope. Functional parents will have broken hearts and will do everything they can to take the pain away and heal the pain of the child. This is the role and the relationship that God's law has for us in His Word. It's encouraging us to live the best way we can in our life to avoid those things that can hurt us and cause us pain. But at the same time, when we make the mistake, God doesn't rejoice in our pain and our agony. He doesn't turn His back away from us. And it's with those things in mind that we can understand this encounter that took place between Jesus and the Pharisee in the gospel lesson. As we encounter these two over dinner, we come to see these contrasting views concerning sin and forgiveness and its relationship in our lives. See, the Pharisee, as the teacher of the law, he believed that sin was all about the eternal scorecard to see who was worthy and who wasn't worthy. And so he sees this woman who's wiping Jesus' feet with her tears in her hair, and he knows her life, and he even goes so far as saying, she's a sinner. And then he attempts to discredit Jesus as a good prophet, because any good prophet would know what a horrible, horrible woman and sinner she was, and certainly would not have allowed her to touch him. But Jesus uses this occasion to tell us what we really need to know about forgiveness. See, as Jesus encounters the Pharisee, as he has the example of the woman, he shows us that forgiveness is so much more than we realize and think in our lives. I think forgiveness is this term that's often talked about in church, but greatly misunderstood. Forgiveness isn't merely this scorecard of rewards and consequences. Forgiveness isn't merely just being declared not guilty. Forgiveness isn't this system or process of trying to get right with God in the hopes that He likes us and loves us. See, forgiveness is all about relationship and love. I get so frustrated sometimes when I'm watching the news and you get the reports of these major trials for horrible crimes, right? And as you see these reports, all of a sudden it's inevitable. There'll be some sort of interview with the parent of the victim that this criminal carried out the crime against, right? And to their credit, you'll sometimes see them say something like, well, this was a horrible, horrible thing, but I forgive the criminal for what they've done. Yet as the details of the stories come out, you realize that the criminal could care less, is unrepentant, actually finds some joy in the pain that's been inflicted on someone else. And as much as those parents may want to show full forgiveness, it's a misunderstanding of what it's all about because the system hasn't been closed. See, the parents, we are thankful, have a contrite and gracious and merciful heart. And their desire would be to bring healing to where brokenness occurred. But because of the unrepentant heart of the criminal, there is no relationship and no opportunity for forgiveness to take place. Forgiveness is probably one of those things we struggle with the most in our lives and in our relationships. We so often want to fix what's broken, and sometimes we misunderstand God's grace and forgiveness as this excuse for us to be abused by others and walked on by others. But the fact of the matter is, it's a relationship thing. We pray that we have a gracious and merciful heart, that if someone comes to us to fix what is broken, to find forgiveness, that we can do it. This helps us to understand what was meant in Jesus' encounter with Peter when he talks about forgiving your neighbor 7 times, 70 times. The key there is that Jesus said, if your brother comes to you 7 times, 70 times, 77 times, or however you want to look at the numbers, then repair the relationship. See, that helps us understand this story that Jesus tells about the debtors as he's putting the Pharisee in his proper place. See, Jesus, as he talked about the one with the greater debt, knowing forgiveness and knowing love, understands and knows that the more in our lives we see our own sin and our need for forgiveness, the more we see the great price that has been paid for us by Christ on his cross, and the more we understand our place in the universe and our relationship with others. The Pharisee didn't see any of his own sin. Therefore, he didn't think he needed forgiveness. And as a result of that, he could continue to self-righteously judge everyone else, especially the woman. But the woman, she was honest and realistic about her life. She knew how much help she needed, how much forgiveness she had received. And it humbled her. And empowered her. And in those actions, we see what our life is about as the people of Christ, as the church. And there's plenty of examples of this for us today. I have found throughout my life in ministry that the people who think they have the most skeletons in their closet to hide, the people who have struggled the most in their life and dealt with some of the more difficult things and painful experiences, are usually the people who are far more accepting, far more loving, and far more forgiving than others. That's what Jesus meant when he tied forgiveness to love. That's what's at the heart of it. And I would much rather have a church that's filled with forgiven sinners than perfect people. And the irony of Jesus' encounter with the Pharisee in the gospel lesson is that the Pharisee was mocking Jesus, saying, if only he knew what a sinner this woman was, then he wouldn't let her touch. But the reality in the lesson for us is if only the Pharisee knew himself and his own sin and his own life, and if he knew those things, he would know forgiveness, and if he knew forgiveness, he would probably be more accepting and more loving of those around him. This is the foundation of our lives as the people of God. That's why Jesus said, therefore I tell you, her sins, which were many, have been forgiven. Hence she has shown great love. But the one to whom little is forgiven loves little. Just like everything else in our faith life, it comes down to that one simple word: love. The more we experience the forgiveness and the grace of God in our lives, the more we experience his love. And the more we experience that love, the more others will see that love through us, and the more they will be welcomed here.